He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
And we are back. It's the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. I'm Jack Heald, the resident idiot. And we have today we have a guest today that when I was doing my research, I went, man, I would really love to sit down over a glass of whiskey with this dude with no time limit.
So we had to do this on Zoom? Whiskey was an option?
I'm sorry.
Part
Talk
two,
to the doctor. Hey, it's not my thing. We have today author Scott Carney. Phil, over to you.
Yeah, very good. Been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. I think first learned about Scott a number of years ago. He has a number of very interesting books. The ones that caught my attention at first were The Wedge and What Doesn't Kill Us. And those are going to be relevant to sort of our usual topics. But then he has others that I think go into some other fascinating areas, and maybe we'll get into all of it. Scott's been a contributing editor at Wired. He's written for Men's Journal, Playboy, number of other very well-known publications, and has been radio, television, NPR, National Geographic TV, all of that good stuff. But really excited to hear about some of the unique health-related topics and really mindset-related topics that Scott has written about. And with that, welcome, Scott. Why don't you fill in a little bit of the details for our audience as to your background and how you got interested in some of this stuff.
Thanks so much for having me on. This will be an interesting conversation. I love talking with doctors. You know, this morning I just woke up like super early and jumped in an ice bath and tested my blood work beforehand, and then right after I tested my blood work again. And I don't have the results yet, but assuming something happened, and we'll see. But yeah, I'm an investigative journalist, an anthropologist. And I live 6 years in India, and I have just a ton of books on like randomly, seemingly disconnected subjects. You know, I started by investigating organ trafficking around the world. I've written, from war zones. I've written about organized crime. I've written about cults, and I was starting to get my career underway debunking fake gurus and people, especially with people who are teaching that you can achieve superpowers, like sort of like abnormally big things. And then I heard about this guy named Wim Hof, who was saying he could like sit on icebergs and like melt the ice with his body. And I was like, that's crazy. And I tried his method. And the short story of this is that it worked. And then I wrote this book called What Doesn't Kill Us, about my experience with Wim Hof, when he was just at the very beginning of his career, and how that journey changed my life. And then I've written sort of follow-up books about that with a concept that I call the wedge, which is what you do in a stressful environment, your mindset in that environment, how that mindset plus the interaction of the stress that's coming into your nervous system, how that changes your physiology. And then I most recently wrote a book about climate change and war. So I'm sort of really just all over the place.
Well, I want to hear about the effect of stress on your physiology.
Sure.
I'm not a doctor. I get to play the guy who says, I don't understand what you're saying, but you're not a doctor either. So maybe we can talk to each other. Yeah. And Dr. O can keep us scientifically straight as we work through this. Explain for our listeners what happens when our bodies are under stress physiologically.
Oh man, that is too general of a question, unfortunately. But you can
okay,
think about
feel free to refine it.
So the human organism, or any organism at all in the world, has to deal with its relationship with the environment, right? It has to decide. There are like decisions that your body already has locked in. So if let's say we're talking about ice water, right? When you jump into ice water, your body says, okay, we're going to shunt the blood to the core by constricting the muscles, the smooth muscle in your veins, and move it there. And the body, through the process of evolution, has said no consciousness required, right? We will just do this. However, there's also this conscious component where you could look at an ice bath and say, hey, I don't want to go in there because that would be bad. And so, and it's this tension between what the languages that's going on in your head and your physiological reactions, which is where consciousness, human consciousness, and probably animal consciousness too, exists. And you can still trigger those vasoconstriction and the responses to the cold water by literally getting in. And we're, the senses of anxiety and depression and these other sensations that we feel in our sort of emotional centers of the brain relate directly to physiological sensations that we would have in the environment. And that's all very high level stuff.
Yes,
so
it is.
we can get, we can go down lower. Yeah.
Well, one of the fascinating things to me about the work that Wim Hof has done and others is this. We have a perception. Most of us have a perception like that things inside our body, we are not in control of. We can't consciously alter the reaction to cold water, like for an example. But Wim Hof has clearly shown that you can, and that we probably have a lot more control over these things than we think we do, than we give ourselves credit for. And it's just fascinating to kind of explore how far you can take that. Sure. And Wim Hof has certainly taken that beyond what most people would consider the limits. Sure. But maybe talk a little bit about when you were first going through the process, what that was like, trying to control these things that you perceive not to be controllable.
Yeah, well, the way I like to think of it is that every sensation that you feel in your body ever is a choice, right? It's an offering of a choice, right? Where if you get into ice water, for instance, or you're looking over a cliff, or you're driving your car down the road, your body has these automatic responses to it. I mean, think about driving on a highway. You're accelerated with hundreds of thousands of pounds of metal, of steel going at 60 miles an hour. That is actually legitimately terrifying. Yet all of us are like, this is no problem. I can do this, because we have all tamed our nervous systems in that environment. Now, I was 15 and a half years old, and I first got my learning permit, I felt all 15,000 pounds of steel around me, and I worried about it. And we literally just decide how our body wants to react to that environment. And we're all master, and this is what I call the wedge, right? The wedge is like, there's an external stimulus that gives you some sort of stressful choice. And then your decision to change, to alter your perception of that environment has these downstream effects on your physiology. Now, in an ice bath, our initial reaction, anyone who's thinking right now, what does it feel like to take a cold shower? What does it feel like to rub ice on your nipples, or whatever, right? You have this idea of like, that will not be pleasant. Yeah. I don't know, maybe people have ice nipple things, that's different, but like the idea is that it's not going to be pleasant, and I don't want to do that. Everyone says to me the first time they hear what I do, that they do not want to do this because they are especially scared of the ice. But the thing that you learn is that is just the anticipation. That is just anxiety. That is just like your mind casting the world's worst reactions. And when you get into the ice, you realize that the sensations that it offers are primal. They are evolutionarily hardwired, right? It's gonna activate your sympathetic nervous system, which your fight or flight response is. This is adrenaline and cortisol and all these like sort of like pain relieving, energy boosting systems. And then you realize that you have this choice. Do I engage that system and hyperventilate, shake, shiver, whatever else? Or do I say to myself, this isn't so bad and I can do it? Like whatever, that's just sensation on my skin. And everyone, the reason why ice water is such a great training place is because everyone has this evolutionary reaction to cold, and it's always go into fight or flight, always panic, always fly out of that ice water as quickly as possible. but you realize, like literally within 10 seconds of being in cold water, you realize that you actually have complete control over what you want to do there. And I can relax in an ice bath. I can just be totally calm. And I've taken half an hour ice baths at 32-degree water and been fine. Whereas, if you look at like hypothermia tables, I should have been dead at 10 minutes. And it's because I'm able to interact with my nervous system and just say, I'm okay. It's going to be fine. Which has like, go on. Yeah.
What was that process? Because at some point you weren't there and then you got there. Talk about the in-between, the going from
that is
now.
That is the wedge, right? That is that interesting synapse between the environment and consciousness itself, like human consciousness. When I said that every sensation is a choice, I think that's why we were evolutionary hardwired in the first place to be conscious, right? Is because at some point you have these evolutionary things that are in there that says, an organism, it runs away from cold or runs away from CO2 or lava or whatever it is. We go away from that stuff. But at some point, the environment is so complex that it needs to seed some of that that sensory information into cognitive processing software. And that's where how we experience consciousness is. And like you use it, we are conscious all day. We look around outside. We say, hey, that's the postman and not a murderer coming to drop, look into my mailbox. And if it was a murderer, you would have a very different physiological response. And the cool thing about ice water is it's so predictable, right? I know how you're going to feel when you get in there. I know that the way I feel in ice water is precisely how you are going to feel in ice water from a nerve standpoint, from an emotional reaction standpoint. And the only thing that's different is how you choose to respond to that environment.
What do you say? And time for true confession here. I actually enjoy a cold dip as well.
Great.
This time of year, it's fantastic in Phoenix because I just checked the water. It was 52 degrees yesterday, which is not 32, but
it's cold.
It's a nice enough difference between my 104-degree spa. So I go from the spa and then I go into the pool. But so I'm not speaking from a place of ignorance, but there's an awful lot of our listeners whose health journeys are barely begun. Talk about the physiological benefits, how you feel different. And if you've got this, I haven't read your book, so I apologize. If you have the information, what's actually happening under our skin when we choose to master this particular type of behavior?
Well, when we get into the physiology, there's a lot going on, right? You have millions and millions of processes going on all the time. So it's actually a little bit difficult to really get into that. But, I want to talk from an evolutionary perspective at first. The human species is about 3 to 5 million years old, depending how you want to cut that off. And throughout the course of history, and life on the planet is about 3 billion years old, then the planet's about 5 billion years old. Every organism in that entire time had to deal with changing environments. Okay. It was hot, it was cold, there were brutal things, there were things, and our tool to survive has been you change your biology in some way in order to respond to that environment. Now, one of the things that's terrible about modern human life is that while we may have been on in the plains of the Sahara and might go up to 110 in the morning at noon and maybe down to 50 at night, your bodies were making that change, which means your the muscles in your arterial system, the smooth muscle in your arterial system would clench and dilate and sort of stretch in and out. You'd use all these different hormones and all these different things were going on in your body, and it was triggered by the environment. Now, come to about 1910, we are now in more or less total control of our environment. We are not cold in the winter and we're not hot in the summer. You live in Phoenix, where in the summer, it's not habitable by humans. Like no human can live in Phoenix right now in July. But you do. And why do you do that? Because you have climate control, because we have water available at a touch. And where human biology used to always have these up and down changes of all sorts, and there were sensations that were paired with those changes. Now we live in a numb environment, and we are not getting the environmental signals that change our biology. So what we're doing, not just with ice water, but also with heat, with fear, with anything that makes you feel something, you're giving your body variation. And those variations, because they were the standard before, are giving your unconscious system, your nervous system, the stuff that it needs. And now if we look at the problems that plague the modern world, right, we have autoimmune illnesses, we have anxiety, depression, we have cancers, we have like tons of stuff's going haywire in us, even though we've figured out with antibiotics and amazing Western medicine, right, we can deal with any acute condition right now, basically. But the chronic conditions, Western medicine's terrible at dealing with. It's just not good at dealing with it. And probably most of your patients are dealing with chronic problems, things that manifest for a long period over time. And then they have an acute phase where you suddenly have the big painful moment. And then then Western medicine comes in and we're able to patch that up. But the underlying causes aren't fixed. And I'm not saying that ice baths are the panacea to everything out there. That is not the argument. But what I am saying is that adding these variations into your life changes things. And in particular, in my own experience, it changes autoimmune reactions. It changes depression. It changes anxiety. And we can talk about the science of that pretty deeply if you'd like to.
I'd like to talk more deeply about that, but I want to make sure that our listeners understand what you just said, that these types of environmental stressors, in this case, extreme hot or extreme cold, have a beneficial physiological effect that you can feel. You don't have to go measure it. You can actually tell things are better, things are different. And you specifically listed for yourself, what'd you say, depression, anxiety?
Autoimmune illnesses.
Oh, autoimmune illnesses. Okay, that's huge. Phil, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that, one of the things that's been said is, we sort of have this crisis of comfort, and we have lost the ability or lost the desire to, be uncomfortable. And that's contributing to, many of the things you mentioned. And I would even add, what we focus so much on in this podcast and in my work is, metabolic health and, this, all of these modern diseases like diabetes and obesity and heart disease, have a lot to do with how we interact with our environment these days. So for someone's out, for our audience out there who is thinking, well, I don't plan to go do a 32-degree ice bath anytime soon. Is this useful for my day-to-day life? How can I use this to improve my health and my day-to-day life? What would you say to those people?
Well, I would say chronic illness as in general, right? And we have to talk about generalities because there's always specifics. We're like, well, yeah, of course, that's not true.
Yeah.
But so chronic illness is in general arises out of your relationship with the things that you do in your life, right? So if we want to talk about, let's do it really, really easy. If we want to talk about obesity, one great way to get obese is change the environment in your kitchen to all Snickers bars. Okay. If you eat just Snickers bars and your environment of your food is just Snickers bars, I promise you will put on weight. And that's just because that you create a food environment. So lifestyle is very important. And I look at lifestyle in a way, sort of like a drug, right? Sort of like if you do these things, you will get these other outputs. If you feel these sorts of sensations, you're able to sort of more fine tune the way that your body reacts. Now, I will say it's not a hard science, right? I can't say, for instance, that tickling you sets off this hormonal reaction that will cure diabetes. Like, that's not the way this works. This is more saying, like, we need variation, we need strong sensation sometimes. And I know that you said that maybe your listeners are never going to want to do an ice bath. Well, one of the reasons they may never want to do an ice bath is because they feel so comfortable all the time. And as you feel more comfortable, as you said, there's a crisis in comfort, is that if you don't have range in the stuff you're going to do, and you're totally fine staying on your couch and watching Netflix. And that is the way you have organized your entire life, so that if you go to the mailbox, that's terrifying. And people do get to this point, right? Where you have so narrowed your environment and your range that you can't do stuff. Now, I'm imagining most of your listeners are not just eating Snickers and watching Netflix, but I wanted to take this to sort of a logical extreme. Now, if you do harder things, like if you got that person off of their Netflix couch and they walked around the block once a day, the first times you do that will be stressful, right? Because it is novel, it is different. There's more stimuli coming into your internal environment, into your mind, into your sensory system, and it's going to be hard. For me, now when I look at an ice bath, I still think, that doesn't look so fun. But I know that it changes my entire perception of what is difficult in the first place. And the cool thing about ice baths is that there's a big difference between the anticipation of the uncomfortable stimulus and your body's response when you realize, because you probably haven't done one if you're listening to this, right? When you actually get in there and you forget about that anxiety, and then you say, oh, actually, it's ice water, and it may not be the best, right? I may not want to live in ice water for the rest of my life, but I can handle it. And I can handle it. If I can handle ice water, what else can I handle? And that's where you get this cool generalization ability to handle stress in general, because your body has two basic neural responses, right? One is fight or flight and one is rest and digest, right? And you only can be in both one or the other state. There's not like a third branch of the vagus nerve, which is called watch Netflix, right? Where only the Netflix nerve works. No, you can be in fight or flight, or you can be rest and digest, or you can be in some mixture of the two. It's not like a faucet where you turn it on and off. It's actually two branches, and they both have to be innervated at the same time in one way or another. When you can master one of those branches, the ice water is a great way to trigger fight or flight, because your body interprets that signal as death. Like, it looks at ice water, it says, this is death. And then your body goes into the response to, I don't want to die response. And then you can control that response in the face of death. Well, you just freaking hacked your whole life. You hacked your entire response to your environment. And that's why anxiety gets better, because anxiety is not only the anticipation of what's going on in the outside world, looking through your eyes and your mind. It's actually a sensation that you feel in your body. It's a tightness in your chest. It is the release of adrenaline. It is the release of cortisol. It is your fight or flight response not being properly modulated in a fight or flight situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're saying is that you used to struggle with anxiety?
Well, I mean, everyone struggles with some anxiety. What I will say is that when I do these methods, the days are qualitatively easier, right? That I've always been something of a risk taker. I've always been someone who's been able to go. I mean, I was a war correspondent for years. It's like, I've been in the areas where the bullets are flying. Most people wouldn't do that, but I still get anxious about things, about stupid things. I will sit up at night and I will think about a stupid thing and I'll crunch on it through the night, and we're all humans. I will say that anxiety is a struggle that we all have to some degree. For me, it's never crushing. But for people I know who get panic attacks and actually do struggle with this stuff, these practices are great. What I will say that's truly amazing is the autoimmune stuff. So,
yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
If you want to think about your immune system, like the critters, let's call them critters, right? In your immune system, you got your B cells, you got your T cells, you got your macrophages, you got your killer T cells. I mean, there's all these different components, but we're just going to call them critters. And the type of critters they are is wolves. Okay. And their job is to go after the bad stuff that goes in your body, say like a virus or a bacteria, and eat them, kill them in various ways. I'm super simplifying this, and I hope that our doctor pal here is like, oh my God, how do I get it from wolves to real science? Okay, no, we've got wolves in our body, and they're wolfing around, and they're trying to kill the bad stuff. But we live, and they live in a bloodstream, and lymphatic systems and stuff like that. But they live in your body, and they feel the same stuff that your body releases. And now we know there's lots of scientific papers saying that if you give a macrophage and you bathe it in adrenaline, a macrophage eats bacteria and viruses, rips them apart. It's called the big eater. If you bathe it in adrenaline, it waves its flagella a lot faster, right? It's like, oh my God, I'm in adrenaline. It sort of reacts like you do. And so if you bathe it in adrenaline all the time, it's gonna like look for things to eat. Now we live in an environment that does not have a lot of pathogens in it in general, right? We do not get a lot of variation in our physiological responses because we're comfortable. And like any wolf pack, wolves get bored, okay? And we got bored wolf macrophages, and they're gonna be like, I'm gonna go eat your, the myelin sheath on your nerves, right? To give you multiple, is that multiple sclerosis? The
multiple sclerosis.
Yeah.
Yep.
You got arthritis in your joints. You got lupus. And it's funny because when you start talking about these things, the question of autoimmune gets a little sketchy. But like, these wolves start attacking you and the stuff that is tagged as you because it is bored or it is bathed in adrenaline. Now, when we do things like jump in ice water, where the correct environmental response, your body's saying death, and you modulate your adrenaline so it's down, you are, and this is scientifically speaking, giving those wolves chew toys now. And so they're able to chew on the toys, and the wolves don't bother you. Now, again, I'm using all metaphorical language here, right? We could actually use some clinical language, and I'll give you an example of how this worked with Wim Hof a few years ago.
Yes,
and I was around during these studies. So Wim Hof's method is a breathing method and an immersion in ice. And you can learn it in like 40 minutes. You could be a master in the Wim Hof method in like 40 minutes. It's not hard, but it does involve getting into ice water and being like, this is okay. And then there's some breathing stuff that you do. Now, Wim Hof made the claim that he could consciously turn off his immune system if he wanted to in a clinical environment. And doctors say this is impossible. Your immune system is not attached to your brain. You can't turn it off. And so what he said, no, that's bullshit. I can do it. So what he lived nearby in Radboud University in Nijmegen in Holland. There was one of the people who had designed the test for anti-rejection drugs for when you get like an organ transplant. So like cyclosporin. But if you get someone's kidney into your body and you install it and it's not a perfect match, your immune system will eat it. So what you need to do is you need to turn off or down your immune system so that your body doesn't eat that thing. And he had designed a test of those drugs. What Wim was saying is that I am the drug, right? That I can do the drug without the drug. That's what he was saying. And the way the test works is you inject somebody with a heat-killed E. coli bacteria. This is called endotoxin. And so it's not dangerous, but your immune system recognizes it as a foreign pathogen. When you inject it, your body should respond like you're under attack. You get a fever, you get the sweats, you get the achy joints, you get all the primary immune responses. Wim said that you could inject it with endotoxin with just a little power of willpower and some breathing, no response. And that would be identical to cyclosporin. So what did they do? They injected Wim with the endotoxin and there was no response. Nothing interesting anyway. And that was like crazy. That was bananas. And maybe Wim's a freak. And I will tell you from experience, Wim is a freak. So that was correct. And maybe it's some genetic anomaly because 99% of trials go one way, but there is that 1% weirdness. So 1 week after I met him in 2013, they brought, I believe it was 20, it might've been 12. Look at the paper, you can link to it somewhere. I believe it was 20 Dutch college students, and they did the training with him for a week where they dunked in ice water and they did the breathing and blah, blah, blah. And then they brought them back to Radboud University and they injected all of them with endotoxin and none of them had any response.
After a week.
after just a week of training. And I think you could even do it faster. And now here's my personal experience. After training with Wim in 2013, but prior to that, I would get canker sores in my mouth, which were about the size of a dime. I was I was a terrible, I would thought of myself as like a canker sore survivor, because they'd come and they'd last for a week and they'd be there about once every month, and it sucked. It wasn't like cancer, right? It was a canker sore, but I hated it. I started doing the Wim Hof method, not thinking about canker sores at all. Just that was not the reason I was doing this at all. I just did it because it felt good. And the canker sores never came back. And I've only had 2 in 10 years of doing the Wim Hof method. And they used to come every week. And, canker sores are probably a response to a herpes virus that I contracted as a kid. And then that you sort of clear the herpes virus. But the body still occasionally is like, oh, you bit your lip, let's start a canker. And now that doesn't happen because my wolves, well, they have chew toys.
I mean, that's, yeah, quite fascinating. I guess, what do you think the limits of this are? So let me, we talk a lot about on this program, like I said, metabolic health and diet and lifestyle to overcome your metabolic health problems. How much of a bad environment can you fight off with this? And I'm sure you probably eat pretty well. You probably, eat a pretty healthy diet. But, could you imagine, can this fix metabolic health without changing your diet? For instance, if someone is eating the Snickers bars, like you said, can we change our response to Snickers bars?
Ooh, I don't know. Let's do a test. I think maybe if you wanted to be really uncomfortable, right? So there was this study that came out in Nature, I think about 6 months ago, that looked at this question of the Warburg effect, right? So and the Warburg effect is essentially cancer cells. Like I think it's like 90% of cancers feed abnormally high, well on sugar. They eat more sugar than the average human cell for metabolic reasons. And I'm sure you can just, you can science it up for us. But like basically cancer feeds on sugar. And if you give someone a low sugar diet and pair that with mild, prolonged cold exposure, so like turning the thermostat in your house down to like 60 all the time, what they found is that tumor growth radically reduced in both mice and in humans. The study was still small. I think they need to do some follow-ups to make it this really, really good. But basically what the idea is that if you cut sugar in your diet, and then you do cold thermogenesis, that's like heating yourself in the cold, what happens is that your body in cold environments sucks sugar out of your bloodstream and wherever else sugar is stored and burns it directly for heat energy. And this is what if you've heard of brown fat, this is a metabolic tissue that humans genetically have, but we usually just never use it. But its role is to suck out sugar from your system, burn it for heat. But if you've never lived in an uncomfortable environment, you've never really activated it in your recent life. And so for the Snickers question, maybe if you want to over ramp up your BAT, like if you lived at like 34 degrees ambient air temperature forever, you might be able to get away with just Snickers bars, but I would not recommend it. And I'm not going to do the experiment because it sounds actually really horrible.
No, I wouldn't recommend it either, certainly. And then, I guess the other question is there something unique about cold as a stimulus versus other, possible uncomfortable things that you could do?
Cold's easy. And I think that's what it is. It's primal. And I feel like, and there's a little bit of a philosophical question here. I feel like my sensations that I feel in my nervous system are similar to your sensations. And I think this is a somewhat of a leap of faith, right? Is that you feel what I feel, because we can't actually communicate what our feelings are. We can only communicate emotions. But I believe, as an act of faith, that your sensations are similar to my sensations. And that if I dump you in ice water, you're going to feel roughly what I feel in ice water. If I dump a cat in ice water, it's going to feel roughly the same things that I feel in ice water. And I think that Now I've totally lost the question. Why was I talking about cats in ice baths? I don't know. What was your question again?
Well, we originally started with what are the limits?
Oh,
And
crap.
And then we were talking about what's unique about cold.
Oh, what's unique? There we are. What's unique about cold? We'll get back to the other question in a second. What's unique about cold is it's standardizable, right? I can say at 34, your nervous system's going to react slightly different than 48 to 56 and onwards. And I find it's a very easy and quickly teachable tool. However, I did write an entire book called The Wedge, which said, like, after you've been doing this for 10 years, what's next? And honestly, that concept of putting yourself in a stimulus and realizing you have a choice is a practice that you can use in any situation. You can use it while giving a podcast. You can use it while sitting in your office. You can use it while skydiving. Like, the environment's always offering you a choice. Like, every second you have a choice, and you can pilot a lot of your life by saying, is this really a danger? Is this not? And then calming your nerves in those situations. And you do that by both the internal calming your nerves, and then also giving yourself range of sensations, like actively seeking out range in general, in any horizon, in anything that you do. Looking for range is very, very important.
You know, this reminds me of just a weightlifting principle of progressive overload. Every session, every leg session should be just a little bit heavier, a little more weight than the previous one. And we're constantly pushing our boundaries. My oldest son does powerlifting, and I went to a meet with him, and there was a guy there, 70, I think he said he was 76 years old. I asked him, I said, how long have you been lifting? He said, since I was 14. And he was there that day to attempt to set an age group record in the bench press. He was going to bench press 450 pounds.
Oh, man.
As a 76-year-old man. Parenthetically, he got the weight up, but it wasn't, the judge said, whatever. It wasn't in the powerlifting world. It wasn't an official lift. So he didn't get credit for the record, but he got the weight up. I remember when my kids we'd first moved to Arizona. This is back in the mid 90s. And we took them to a place called Biosphere 2. It was
outside of Tucson.
Yeah, outside of Tucson. It was a biological experiment where they'd put, I think it was 7 people inside this sealed environment in an attempt to, I think long term it was, can we build an environment that humans can live in on another planet? But the thing that has stuck with me from that particular visit goes back to this range thing. The proctor told us about these trees that had grown inside the biosphere. I don't remember the species, but they noted that the trees grew very fast, very straight, and they were really impressed with this beautiful environment for growing they'd created inside biosphere, right up until the trees fell over under their own weight.
Yeah.
And what they realized, that in the absence of wind, in the absence of these constant stressors, the trees, although they appeared to be as healthy as a tree could be, actually had no tensile strength whatsoever and literally couldn't support their own weight. So, that's a principle that apparently is woven into our biology everywhere we look. I suspect woven into more than just biology.
Yeah, I agree. This is the concept of hormesis, right? If you want a fancy Greek word, right, where you give subtle stresses to things to make them stronger. And one classic example of this is that if you give something a little bit of poison, not a lot of poison, just a little bit of poison, everything gets better about the physiology of that creature. And a famous example is with arsenic on birds' eggs, right? You put a little arsenic on the birds' eggs, and you put it in that environment, and all of the birds, like many more birds, hatch correctly. But if you put too much, obviously kill all the birds. So it's finding the right amount of stress, right? And the right amount of things that could kill you, but not overdosing on it. So it's like, yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. It's that subtle training. It's the subtle tensions that we feel all the time, because otherwise you're that tree that falls over in Biosphere 2. And that was the worst movie ever that came out of the 90s. Had Pauly Shore in it, and I do not recommend it.
Well, if it had Pauly Shore in it, I think it goes as a don't see anyway. So Phil, let's bring this thing back around to what this show is typically about, which is how to go from a state of poor health to a state of robust health.
Exactly. And I think this can certainly play a part. So, my question for Scott would be, how do you start? The people in our audience that are intrigued, should they just go jump in the cold river, or, do you build yourself up gradually, or what are some resources? How should they get started with this?
Well, everyone's different. So you got to go find your own way, because there's not going to be one practice that works right for everyone. And you also can't be forced into doing something. Like you can't, say, to your wife, I really want to get into ice baths, and force her into the ice bath. She's not going to say yes to this. You're going to break up your marriage, right? But I think that you can start easy, right? There's no problem with starting easy by sitting in a warm shower and then turning it cold. And actually, in some ways, I find that harder than anything else, because you're in this already like ideally comfortable environment, and then why are you going to go ruin it? And actually, the swing in temperature from like 104 degrees out of the faucet down to colder, depending on where you are on, whatever the water table is at, can actually be a little jarring, but it is locally available to you right now. I actually think it's better to start off in a cold shower and then turn it warm later. Like start off with the anxiety and be like, okay, I'm going to go in and it's going to be hard. And you sit there until it is sensation on your skin, right? That it's no longer an emotional reaction to it, which is the tensing, cold, and nothing like that. It's like you're there and you sit there until it is sensation on your skin. And then you move the cold water to the part of your body that you don't want it. Wherever it is you don't want the cold water, put the cold water there. And this is a very easy practice available to anyone who has a shower. Go into, if you're in California right now, go swim in the Pacific Ocean. If you're in, if it's liquid water, it's going to be above 32. I promise you. And if it's above 32, I know you personally, you listening to me right now, can handle 3 minutes in that temperature. And your goal is to be calm. And that's it. Now, in addition, if you want to start building up, what I do every morning is I do 3 rounds of the Wim Hof breath work, which is, you just look that up on YouTube. It's everywhere. But it's essentially hyperventilating, exhaling, and holding your breath on the exhale. And then until you're at the point where like, oh man, I really got to breathe. This is uncomfortable. And then you hyperventilate and you get dizzy. And then you exhale and you hold your breath until you feel like you have to go again. And then you do that 3 or 4 times. And then you hyperventilate, exhale, and do push-ups, maybe as many as you can. I don't care about your form. You don't have to be a Navy SEAL. Do it on your knees. Don't care. Whatever you want to do, but you're doing this while holding your breath, and you will realize that that the push-ups are easier than you've ever tried, than they've ever been for you before. And this practice I find really useful because it's very eye-opening for people, because they're like, oh, this was cool. Oh my God, I held my breath for 2 minutes. Oh my God, isn't that amazing? And I don't think it's the time that matters, but that surprise is the doorway to a whole world of playing with sensations.
I have a suspicion that we've got people who are struggling with their weight and have been for a long time listening to this. Well, I know that is your audience, but I have a suspicion that some of those people might need this psychological lever or wedge, maybe, to borrow a phrase, as a way to get started. I can see, Yes, I'm a big fan of cold plunges. I was feeling crappy yesterday. I just had a bad day. Went and got in the spa, 104 degrees, sat there for I don't know how long, and then went and got in the pool. And 3 minutes in the pool completely redid everything felt better. Just everything felt better. It was like I got a burst of energy that I didn't have. I've been doing this long enough that I don't get freaked out by it most of the time. I do occasionally have one of these, oh crap. Okay, here. And then when I do that, when I feel that way, I realized if I will dive into the pool rather than walk in on the stairs, just get it over with quicker.
Yeah.
And just
well, I think you're right that especially if you're talking about weight, right? There are totally metabolic things that are going on here that will help you lose weight from a metabolic perspective, but I'm actually not super interested in that. I'm more interested in the sense that you get into that cold environment and then you realize you have control over yourself. I think that's actually more important than the sugar burning aspects of this, because once you start feeling you have control over some aspect of your life, your breath, your responses, that can trigger changes overall your whole body and in your whole life in general. It's like, look, I do this thing, and some people think it's weird, but I do this thing, and it makes me feel good because it's going to give you this boost of like endorphins when you go in there, and then you realize you have a tool to click over into that. And I think that with weight, it's funny, I've lost a fair amount of weight recently, and I don't credit it to the ice bath. I've been doing that for a while, but it's all about small changes, right? It's not about saying, look, you can lose 15 pounds in a month by never eating again or whatever, it's about like creating habits that are sustainable and, look at where you're going to be in a year from now, not where you're going to be in February. And those are the things that really change. And I think the easiest way, if I was going to give a recommendation to somebody, if anyone cared about my recommendations, which they don't have to, it's that cut out alcohol, reduce your sugar intake, and do some sort of exercise that you like. Doesn't matter what it is. Some exercise that you like, that you find joy in, and focus on the fun of that exercise, not whether or not you're going to get a six pack. Focus on this is going to be fun. And for me, what I've done recently, and this is bananas, and this is the advantage for all of you male listeners, this is incredibly useful for you, because you have some natural hormone in your body called testosterone, which is an unfair advantage. What I started doing in July is I would do 100 push-ups a month. And I tried to do like the hard ones. 100 push-ups a day, where the hard ones where I sort of went inside, and I went different than I usually do them. And I said, I'm going to do 100 push-ups a day, no matter what. And it can be one push-up at a time. I can do that 100 times, one push-up, walk around my house, and then just do that over the course of a day. And at first, like doing 10 push-ups the hard way was really, really, really hard for me. And I would do 10 sets in the day to get to 100. Now I can do them in 2 sets to get me through my day. And honestly, the muscle changes have been bananas, and I lost like 15 pounds with no other change in anything that I did. And it was just because just push-ups. That was it. That was all I was doing. And I continued. And I'm like, oh my God, my wife's like, oh, you've got muscles. I'm like, I do 100 push-ups, which is nothing. It's nothing. And you could split it up between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. It doesn't matter. It's just a thing that I did. And it brings me joy to do it. It's really funny.
I love it.
Well, I'm gonna go do some push-ups in the cold water bath and really take this next level. But, it's interesting that you just kind of talked about some of those concepts about making sustainable changes and recognizing that you have control over these aspects of your life, and that's certainly concepts that I talk about in my book and all the time. And, I've seen so many people now that you're right. You just need to find that one area of your life to first kind of take control of and make changes. And it ends up translating into so many other areas of your life. A lot of my patients, it starts with they take control of their diet, and then, everything else is getting better. And, and specific to this, it's amazing how many people I've seen, who start, metabolic health, low carb, whatever it is, and they end up at Wim Hof and doing cold plunges and, all of this other stuff, because you just keep saying to yourself, what can I, what else can I take control of in my life?
Yeah, you look at that. You're using your consciousness to decide what sort of environment you want to create around you. And that's what we do really well, right? And it's just our complacency, which we all have. Like, we all love Netflix on White Lotus had this great season this month. I loved it. I binged the whole thing. And you don't have to give up on comfort, but you're right. It's like these beachheads. You create one beachhead and then you build on it, and you don't bite off the whole thing, and you don't have the destination that you don't plan on your destination, right? You don't say, I need to look like this person, right, in this magazine or what, or I need to lose 15 pounds. That goal is irrelevant to your daily practice, because you're not going to lose it in a sustainable way. Things go up and down and they change. But like, if you make that beachhead, I like doing this. This is joyful to me, whatever it is. And if it's in a positive direction, you will build, you will get better. And, and that, I think, is that's the adventure of being alive.
I want to ask some writing nerd questions. Is that okay,
Sure.
Phil?
Sure thing.
What's the one book that you wish that somebody else wrote that you wish you had written?
Oh, Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer.
Oh, it's a good one. You're kind of a Jon Krakauer type of author, aren't you?
Oh, totally. Very experiential. But I also would have liked to write Harry Potter and 50 Shades of Grey and everything that Stephen King wrote. And,
no, I'm taking your first answer. What's the book you haven't written yet that is percolating inside you?
Well, I'm working on 4 books right now. And the one that's I'm doing like next, like I should write it probably in the next 3 months, is on napping and why all of us should take more naps. And I think
we're talking about press your boundaries out, stretch yourself.
But no, napping's a boundary too, because we live in this working grind culture. And we often see napping as lazy, right? We see sleep as lazy, but sleep is restorative. And if you set time aside specifically for napping, it's another one of these beachheads that changes your life. And honestly, I don't even care if people read the book, as long as they look at it and they're like, oh yeah, I should take a nap, and that I won. So that's one book. I'm working on I'm thinking about a book about a cat parasite called Toxoplasmosis gondii.
Toxoplasmosis, yes.
And how it may have made civilization as we see it. So that's an idea. And I want to write another book about the Alamo, and why Santa Anna at the Alamo, the guy who killed all the Texans, was the hero. So that's going to be fun.
Oh yeah. And I suggest you never go back to Texas after that one's published.
I know, but getting banned in Texas would be so fun.
Texas is a hard place to get banned from.
If I remember correctly, now I was looking at your books. You wrote one about despots, about I don't know. Where is it?
I wrote a book recently called The Vortex about the deadliest storm in human history, and how that almost led to.
I must be thinking about somebody else.
Some other dude. There were despots in that book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it got me to thinking about Santa Anna, actually. But if it wasn't you, then there's no point in pursuing that particular rabbit trail. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I would love to hear the maybe, because we're coming up on time here, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the organ trafficking book and story.
Yeah, that's how I got my start. I was a foreign correspondent based in India, and I discovered that a village right next door to where I was living, all the women had sold their kidneys to the local hospitals, essentially, and that triggered just a 6-year investigation into all of the ways that human bodies get bought and sold around the world. And, it's, we have a real problem with the way we deal with human tissues, where we have not resolved many ethical issues with them. And there are, while the idea of donating organs and things or saving lives is a really good, it's really good to save lives, right? The privacy that we have around in HIPAA just the idea that people are protected by medical privacy provides extremely wonderful cover for people to commit horrible crimes. And so I covered that for 6 years. I met a lot of organ traffickers, working in, obviously with kidneys, but also people who bought and sold human skeletons and human hair and human eggs and whole children. And while we have great people who do really good work, in the organ networks, there's also a lot of really bad people. And when you start treating human tissue as a commodity in the legal markets, what happens is you create this, what I call a red market, where crimes really proliferate. And there's quite a bit that's going on all the time. Like there's quite a few stolen kidneys that end up in being processed by American doctors. Oftentimes, there's not a ton that happens in America, but oftentimes people from America will fly to a place like Pakistan or South Africa or Brazil or Philippines, and on and on and on, and get a kidney, and then are processed by the American medical system later. And it is a several $billion-a year industry.
Wow. So Scott, what's the best way for folks to get a hold of you or get a hold of your work?
So I have a cool mailing. Yeah, I've got a great mailing list that sort of highlights whatever I'm on in that particular week. I don't know. You can just go to my website, scottcarney.com, and there should be a pop-up. I also have a YouTube channel, which is my website is scottcarney.com. I have a YouTube channel, which is, search it out. I don't know where it is. And SG Carney at all the places like Instagrams and the Twitters and the,
SG Carney at all the places.
All the places. Yeah.
Very good. Well, this has been fun. I would love to talk writing nerd stuff with you for a long, long time, but that's not what this is about. So thank you.
Very good, Scott. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's a great conversation. I think it's really going to open the minds of many in our audience as to what is possible, and hopefully push them to push their limits.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Appreciate it. Well, for Dr. Philip Ovadia and Scott Carney, I'm Jack Heald. This is the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast. I want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast on whatever your favorite podcast platform is. We drop a new episode every Tuesday. Go to Dr. Ovadia's website at ifixhearts.com and take his metabolic health quiz. Get yourself a baseline about where you really are metabolically, a good way to start and know how you need to improve. And we'll talk to you next time. America is fat and sick and tired. 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy and at risk of a sudden heart attack. Are you one of them? Go to ifixhearts.co and take Dr. Ovadia's metabolic health quiz. Learn specific steps you can take to reclaim your health, reduce your risk of heart attack, and stay off Dr. Ovadia's operating table.